Hello, everyone. It's good to see you. I'm Rick Wright, of Victor Emanuel Nature Tours. I lived in Arizona for a long time, and I miss Arizona, and I miss getting to see many of our old friends who are still fortunate enough to live in Arizona. I'm happy too, though, to see people this afternoon who I hope become new friends and new birding companions. Over the years, in articles and books and lectures and day-to-day conversations, I've indulged an interest in the people behind the discoveries of our familiar birds. Who were they? What were they looking for? And above all, what did they think when they found themselves face to face or nose to mandible with a bird unlike any they'd ever seen before? A bird new not only to them and to their fellow explorers, but new to science entirely, never before described, never before depicted, never before examined in the museums and laboratories of the civilized world. Tracing those stories has become massively easier over the last decade with the advent of the internet, where before it might have taken months, literally months, of library work and foreign correspondence to track down a source. Now, thanks to the digitization efforts of any number of libraries, museums, archives, and other institutions, all it takes in a lot of cases is some creative Googling. No matter how perilous or how convoluted the explorer's itinerary, a lot of the time we can simply sit at our desks and click from link to instantly available link, and soon enough, a story unfolds. The typical route for the modern researcher starts with one of the standard checklists, the Peters checklist or the AOU checklist here, which gives us a citation to the original description, often embedded in a narrative or at least accompanied by brief notes leading to other names and other circumstances and other mysteries that we can follow up on. As an example of how these things can start, consider this bird, the eared Quetzal or the eared trogon, one of Arizona's rarest birds and one that I, unlike many of you, have yet to see in life. The AOU checklist informs us that the bird was originally described and named by the great John Gould, ornithologist, taxidermist, painter, and publishing entrepreneur. He called it Neoxenus, the new and welcome stranger, a romantic name that all by itself justifies further investigation. Turning to the original description in Gould's study of the trogon family, we find a standard diagnosis, Latin and English, followed by a note on the circumstances of the bird's discovery, a note that is full of leads for the curious. Gould mentions his receipt of the bird, telling us right away that he was not the collector. A few lines later, he mentions that the bird had been received from Mexico by John Taylor, another formulation that has us wondering even more intensely about the origins and pathways of this specimen from Mexico to London. A few more clicks and we learn that Taylor was a famous mining engineer of his day with interests in Mexico and Central America. And we learned that at least some of the Mexican birds in Taylor's collections were sent to him by a Mr. Morton of the Rio del Monte Mining Corporation in Mexico. Just as interesting as Gould's note that the unique specimen of his welcome trogon was a young bird, and that the adult remained utterly unknown to be looked for, he says, with the highest interest by every ornithologist. There are ways, too, to find out just who finally did discover mature birds of the species. The synonymies in Robert Ridgway's Great Birds of North and Middle America are probably the easiest means of entry into the relevant literature, most of which, again, is almost certainly available online. This is all great fun, and I urge you to do some e-exploring of your own some lazy afternoon and see what more you can find out. But you will have noticed, I think, that my description of the process and its pleasures begs more than one important question, failing as it does to interrogate such heavily freighted words as discovery, description, first, new. That big bustled trogon may have been Neoxenus, a welcome stranger, to John Gould in 19th century London, and to John Taylor, and to Mr. Morton, the Mexican miner, but surely there were people, and there had long been people, living in the Quetzal's natural range, to whom this bird was neither strange nor new. The notion that any bird or any other organism in its surroundings should require discovery or description, or that anyone could somehow be the first to see a bird, those are ideas culturally and historically contingent, endemic to Enlightenment science and the cult of written recording, but utterly foreign to other cultural and intellectual traditions, whether those traditions are the pre-modern natural history enterprise of Europe or the expertise systems of the native peoples of the New World. As a result, in a culture, our culture, so absolutely dominated by ideas of written priority, there is no space left for what is called indigenous knowledge. Indigenous knowledge, as recorded here in a Maya codex, indigenous knowledge isn't always recorded as knowledge. In part, that's due to the oral mode of transmission characteristic of such knowledge, passed down from generation to generation by telling and retelling. In the case of the native peoples of the Americas, even those cultures that did have writing, so much of their recorded history destroyed by European settlers and colonists suspicious of a literacy so unlike their own. Anonymity, another typical characteristic of indigenous knowledge and its transmission, militates equally against the acceptance of that knowledge into scientific culture, where authorship and authority, creation and credibility are inextricably bound. Even in pre-modern Europe, in the Middle Ages and Antiquity, when authors in many genres often suppress their own names in a conventional gesture of humility, that practice was less frequent in natural, historical, and scientific texts, which were adjudged only as reliable as their creators. It is rare indeed that a specific item of indigenous knowledge can be credited to any named individual. Instead of authors, we have informants, passing on knowledge that belongs to anyone who learns it. Another more subtle, but nevertheless fundamental difference between indigenous knowledge and what we understand now as scientific knowledge is the relationship that each system imposes on knowledge and time. To put it broadly and still tentatively, indigenous knowledge is situated in narrative time, where facts are events in an undifferentiated chronological flow that functions as an eternal presence, a space of simultaneity. This is why bird lore collected from native peoples so often feels as if it were communicated in the form of fables, myths, stories, all told in a vague, continuous past. In stark contrast, everything in modern science relies on measurability, the ability to break phenomena into pieces and allocate them to a precise point on a finely graduated physical or chronological scale. Facts and phenomena are discrete with calculable positions in space and time. It's little wonder, given this rigid worldview, that indigenous knowledge and the ways it's communicated can be so easily dismissed as soft, undisciplined, not even real in a way graspable by the scientific method of the Western Enlightenment. And if indigenous knowledge is beneath notice, then so must be the contributions to scientific knowledge made by indigenous people. One of my favorite examples of how stories of discovery allied the role of non-Western, non-scientists is provided by the black-chinned sparrow, one of my favorite Arizona birds. Internet sources and printed books alike, even those produced by the most authoritative of sources, like this webpage from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, tell us in no uncertain terms that the bird was discovered in 1851 in Mexico by the German ornithologist Jean-Louis Cabanilles, possessor of some of the most impressive facial hair in the history of ornithology. I was immediately suspicious the first time I read this bit of fact, as I knew that Cabanilles did not use his middle name in most of his publications. He always signed Jean Cabanilles or J. Cabanilles, or over the stretch of decades in which he dominated German and European ornithology, simply Cabanilles. I was surprised too to be told here that Cabani had been in Mexico in 1851, especially as he signed the introduction to his catalog of a private collection in October of that same year in Berlin. Something was fishy here. Cabani is, it turns out, the author of the species name Atragularis. There can be no doubt about that. The name translates regrettably as black-throated rather than black-chinned. And he did publish the first description and the name in 1851. And the type specimen did come from Mexico. But Cabani was the discoverer of this species only in the sense that he was the one who got around to dusting the cabinet in the back of the bird room at the Royal Museum in Berlin, where the specimen was kept. It had in fact been in that museum for a good decade by the time Cabani took it out of the drawer for examination. It had been placed there by Cabani's predecessor at the museum, who attached a note to the specimen, recording the name of the donor, Alwin Aschenborn, a gifted young German who dropped out of law school in 1839 to get a glimpse of the New World. Aschenborn quickly contracted the sort of natural history fever typical of so many European visitors to America, collecting, he said, every notable object he could find, including rocks, reptiles, plants, birds and their nests, anything that struck him as new or interesting or exotic. In a letter to a friend back in Germany, though, Aschenborn paints a word picture of his collecting activities that help us discern his actual role and activities in the field. He writes, "If only you could see me on my scientific wanderings. Yours truly is out in front with my dagger and portable plant press, and behind me there is a Mexican soldier with the face of a devil, loaded down with a shotgun, and in the very rear, a half-naked native. While I gather plants, my companions shoot birds. Once I'm back in my lodgings, I'm busy for several days stuffing the birds." If we take Aschenborn at his word, and the image here is not Aschenborn, it is Prince Maximilian in Brazil, but the relations between Aschenborn and his people seem to be very like those depicted in this painting of Prince Maximilian and his people. If we take Aschenborn at his word, the true discoverer of the black-chinned sparrow was not Cabani, who merely published its description, and it was not Aschenborn, who merely stuffed the little corpse before sending it back to Berlin. No, the black-chinned sparrow was actually discovered by a Mexican, either a miserable, low-ranking soldier or an impoverished Indian, both of them left nameless in the German tourist account. Aschenborn's description of his team, with the white European in front, followed by the soldier of presumably mixed race, and both of them trailed by a poor native, that impractical arrangement mirrors Aschenborn's view and the view of much modern science of the relative roles of the European discoverer and his indigenous assistants. Not, I'm sure, that either of Aschenborn's Mexican companions would have minded. The very idea of discovery, as I've already suggested, is bound up entirely with a view of the natural world that is deeply incompatible with that of the people who actually live in it. Neither of the companions that Aschenborn mentions in such disparaging language would have understood or would have cared that they'd been scooped by the German naturalist, that Aschenborn had claimed a priority of encounter that was, in some sense, rightly theirs. Surely they would have been even less concerned with what happened in faraway Berlin to the little sparrow that they had shot while Aschenborn was out plucking his wildflowers. Leaving them out of the story, though, means that there is no story. It reduces the bird to a set of measurements, a little scrap of feathers and dried skin with no connection to its native habitats and to the people who shared them. The story is only slightly more complete when we look at another discovery, the discovery of the spotted Towie on Socorro Island, 400 miles off the coast of Sinaloa. 30 years after Aschenborn's Mexico adventure, the American author and artist Andrew Jackson Grayson, here seen with John Zantis, set out with his son to explore the remote island. The captain of their little boat could find no satisfactory place to drop anchor, and so they settled on a cove surrounded by steep, rocky cliffs. Sure enough, the wind drove the boat onto the rocks where it was crushed, leaving the exploring party with nothing but a small skiff. They were able to rescue all of their collecting supplies, including their guns and ammunition, and there was plenty of fishing to keep them from starvation. The real concern was fresh water. Grayson later wrote that he was pretty certain that the preservation of our lives depended on finding a source of water on the stark and arid island. It seemed hopeless. Grayson and his son had with them an assistant, a 14-year-old native boy named Cristobal. After a few minutes frantic searching, Cristobal called the others over. There, beneath a pile of rocks on the shore, was a tiny trickling spring of warm but fresh, drinkable water. Cristobal had saved the expedition members' lives. He had done it by watching the movements of a Towie, which eventually led him to the spring it was drinking from. The party was rescued 10 days later by a passing steamer. In his account of the episode, published after he finally made his way back to Mazatlan, Grayson thanked the bird effusively. As an English name for this population of Towies, he proposed the water finder. Cristobal, in contrast, he did not even give a last name, just Cristobal. And the rest of what we hope was Cristobal's comparatively uneventful further life is lost to history. In the moments that remain, let's go back to the eared Quetzal. Now I think we look at Gould's formal description of the bird differently. Just the layout on the page reveals the conflict between two modes of knowledge. The description is essentially bullet points in Latin and in English at the top of the page, eloquently separated by the printer's horizontal bar from the prose at the bottom. The description satisfies every requirement of modern science, full of precisely rendered color designations and, of course, measurements. The narrative, in smaller type, low on the page, written in actual sentences with verbs and punctuation, is clearly secondary, clearly of lesser value. But it is that narrative, that incidental commentary, not the cold, dry facts and figures that lead us back somewhere close to the living bird in its relations to its habitats and the people and other animals around it. Only close, though. The chain of information leads from Gould to Taylor to the mysterious Mr. Morton and no further. What would science, what would birding be like if our Mr. Morton, nearly 200 years ago, had sent his friend not just the stunningly beautiful skin of a trogon, but a sense too of what the organism was like in life and what the people thought of it and did with it who lived with it? Wouldn't our appreciation of the bird be quite different, richer and more satisfying if we could see it as part of a narrative not of discovery, but of long cohabitation? The bird would be more than a set of measurements in a book or an excited check mark on a list. It would be part of a physical and intellectual landscape with room for birds and habitats and people too. I invite you to think about these things yourself when you bird and when you think about birds and birding. Just how much of our knowledge do we actually owe to the half-naked natives, the clever Cristobals of the past? And how much more enjoyable our own discoveries in the field, our own firsts, can be if we think of ourselves as their beneficiaries too. I'd like to thank everyone for listening to these comments today, and I hope that if you have comments in return, that you'll get in touch with me by email or by way of the Southwest Wing's office. Thank you very much.